For 22 years, Emma thought her dad was the most boring veteran in Austin. He never talked about his service, never went to VFW meetings, never even mentioned which branch he'd served in. When her friends' fathers shared combat stories, her dad would just quietly change the subject and disappear into his workshop. She was ashamed to bring friends home because he seemed so ordinary. Until the day she accidentally opened his classified military files and realized her boring father had done things that most people only see in movies. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of family, sacrifice, and the secrets some heroes carry in silence, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe that the most extraordinary people sometimes hide in plain sight, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Emma Rodriguez had spent most of her 22 years wishing her father was different. Not different in the typical way daughters complain about their dads. She didn't want him to be cooler, richer, or more permissive about curfew. She wanted him to be proud of something, anything, that would make her proud to call him her father. David Rodriguez worked as a maintenance supervisor at the University of Texas, fixing broken air conditioners and replacing fluorescent lights in campus buildings. He drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dented bumper, wore the same 3 polo shirts in rotation, and spent his evenings in the garage workshop behind their modest South Austin home, building birdhouses that he gave away to neighbors without fanfare or expectation of thanks. At 54, David looked like countless other middle-aged men in Austin. Average height, graying black hair kept military short out of habit more than style. Brown eyes that seemed to hold depths he never shared with anyone, and hands that were permanently calloused from decades of working with tools. He moved with economy and precision, never wasting motions, never raising his voice above conversational level, never drawing attention to himself in any way that might make him memorable. What bothered Emma most wasn't what her father did for work, but what he didn't do socially. She'd grown up around military families throughout Austin. The city was full of them, with Fort Hood just an hour away, and she'd seen how other veterans carried themselves in the world. They wore unit t-shirts to neighborhood barbecues, displayed shadow boxes with folded flags in their living rooms, and told stories at family gatherings that made their children's eyes light up with pride and admiration. David Rodriguez did absolutely none of these things. Emma had pieced together the most basic facts about her father's military service over the years, through overheard phone conversations with VA representatives and fragments of information from her mother, who died in a car accident when Emma was 16. David had served in the Army from 1987 to 2007, 20 years that had taken him overseas on multiple deployments to places he never named. But beyond those bare facts, he revealed nothing, deflecting questions about his service with the practiced skill of someone who'd had decades of experience avoiding certain topics entirely. The shame had started early in Emma's life and grown stronger with each passing year. In elementary school, when teachers asked students to bring in photographs of their parents' careers for career day presentations, Emma had nothing to show except pictures of her father changing light bulbs and fixing broken air conditioning units. In middle school, when her history class studied the Gulf War and Desert Storm and students were encouraged to share family stories from that conflict, Emma had to sit quietly while her classmates talked about their father's heroic service, their medals and commendations, their brotherhood with fellow veterans who remained lifelong friends. By high school, the embarrassment had calcified into something closer to active resentment. Emma's boyfriend, Jake's father, was a Marine who'd served 2 tours in Iraq, and he wore his service like a badge of honor, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories of combat operations, close calls with enemy fire, and the unbreakable bonds formed between men who'd faced life and death together. Emma would sit at Jake's family dinners, watching his father command respect and attention from everyone at the table, then go home to a man who seemed to physically shrink away from any conversation that might touch on his military past. "What did your dad actually do in the Army?" Jake had asked her once, after a particularly animated dinner conversation, where his own father had described leading supply convoys through dangerous territory while under constant threat of roadside bombs. Emma had felt her face burn with embarrassment as she'd realized she had no good answer to give. "I don't really know," she'd admitted, the words tasting like failure in her mouth. "He doesn't like to talk about it. I think he was probably just a mechanic or something boring like that." The assumption had felt safer than admitting she had no idea what her father had done during 20 years of military service. No idea why he seemed almost allergic to anything related to his time in uniform. No idea why the man who'd supposedly served his country seemed so utterly ordinary and forgettable compared to other military fathers who commanded respect through their stories and visible pride in their service. College at the University of Texas had provided temporary escape from these feelings, but they'd returned with renewed force when Emma moved back home after graduating with a degree in journalism. Living in the same house again, seeing her father's quiet, unremarkable routine every single day, had rekindled all the old frustrations about having a parent who seemed to have done nothing during his military career worth remembering, sharing, or taking pride in. The contrast became even sharper and more painful when Emma started dating Marcus Chen, a fellow journalist whose father had served as an Air Force pilot during the same general time period as her father's Army service. Marcus's family gatherings featured elaborate photo albums full of military ceremonies, exciting stories of deployments to air bases around the world, and an impressive display case filled with medals, ribbons, and commendations that spoke eloquently to a life lived with clear purpose and recognizable honor. "Your dad seems really nice," Marcus had said diplomatically after meeting David at a backyard barbecue where Emma's father had spent most of the time quietly grilling hamburgers while Marcus's pilot father entertained the group with animated stories of flying cargo planes into potentially hostile territory during various international crises. "He's fine," Emma had replied, the single word somehow managing to carry all the disappointment and frustration of 22 years of wishing her parent was someone who commanded the kind of automatic respect that other military fathers seem to naturally possess, simply by virtue of their willingness to share their experiences. The breaking point had come 3 months earlier. During Marcus's birthday party at his parents' house in North Austin, the conversation had inevitably turned to family military history, as it often did in Austin social circles, where military connections were common and generally celebrated, and Emma had found herself once again sitting quietly while others around the table shared stories of parents and grandparents who'd served with distinction in various conflicts and earned recognition that their families could point to with obvious pride. "What about your dad, Emma?" someone had asked during a lull in the storytelling. "Didn't you mention at some point that he was in the Army?" Emma had felt every eye in the room turn toward her expectantly, waiting for her contribution to the ongoing conversation about family military service. The silence had stretched uncomfortably long as she'd searched for something, anything, to say that wouldn't reveal the depth of her ignorance about her own father's 20-year military career. "Yeah, he served for a while," she'd finally managed to say, her voice sounding weak and uncertain even to her own ears. "But it wasn't anything special, just regular Army stuff, you know. Nothing worth talking about." The dismissal had felt like a betrayal, even as the words left her mouth. But the alternative, admitting in front of Marcus's friends and family that her father's military service had been so unremarkable that he'd never once shared a single story about it, had seemed even worse than this casual diminishment of whatever he might have done. That night, lying in bed in her childhood bedroom and staring at the ceiling while replaying the evening's conversation, Emma had made a decision that would fundamentally change her understanding of her family and her father. If David Rodriguez wouldn't tell her about his military service voluntarily, she would find out on her own terms. At 22 years old, with a journalism degree and research skills that had been honed by 4 years of investigating stories for the university newspaper, she felt confident that she could uncover whatever mundane details her father was too embarrassed or indifferent to share. The plan had seemed straightforward enough. Wait for her father to leave for his daily work at the university, then conduct a thorough but respectful search through his home office and personal storage areas for any documents, photographs, or records that might give her insight into his military career. She had expected to find evidence of a routine, unremarkable service record, perhaps some basic training photographs, a few standard commendations of the type that every serviceman receives, and documentation of the kind of ordinary military career that might reasonably explain his apparent reluctance to discuss it with family members. What she hadn't expected was to discover that her father kept his most important and sensitive papers locked away in a filing cabinet that would require considerably more investigative persistence than she'd initially anticipated. The key to that filing cabinet had been hidden in a coffee can in his workshop, carefully wrapped in an oiled cloth alongside other small metal objects that looked like spare parts for various projects he'd never quite finished. Emma had found it purely by accident while looking for a screwdriver to fix a loose handle on her bedroom door, not even thinking about the locked filing cabinet until she'd held the small silver key up to the light and recognized its distinctive shape as the type used for office furniture security locks. Even with the key in her possession, she'd hesitated for several long minutes before actually using it. Searching through unlocked drawers and obviously accessible storage areas felt like normal curiosity about a parent's past, the kind of innocent investigation that adult children might reasonably conduct. Using a deliberately hidden key to open files that her father had clearly intended to keep private felt like crossing a moral and ethical line that couldn't be uncrossed, potentially violating trust in a way that might permanently damage their relationship if discovered. But the accumulated frustration of 22 years spent feeling embarrassed by her father's apparent ordinariness had ultimately proven stronger than her ethical reservations. Emma had rationalized her decision by telling herself that she just wanted to understand her own family history better, to find something minus anything that might help her feel genuinely proud of the man who'd raised her instead of vaguely ashamed of his seeming lack of accomplishment or recognition. The filing cabinet had opened with a soft metallic click that seemed to echo through the quiet house like a gunshot. Inside, arranged with military precision, Emma had found 3 hanging folders marked clearly with date ranges: 1987, 2095, 1995, 2002, and 2002, 2007. Each folder was thick with official documents, photographs, and papers that immediately told her this wasn't the record of someone who'd spent 20 years performing routine maintenance duties or administrative paperwork. The first document she'd extracted from the earliest folder had been a Special Forces qualification certificate dated 1989, signed by officials whose names she didn't recognize, but whose titles clearly indicated they were people of significant authority within the military hierarchy. The paper itself was official government documentation, embossed with seals and stamps that spoke to the gravity and importance of whatever accomplishment it represented. Emma had stared at that certificate for a full minute before the implications had begun to penetrate her understanding. Special Forces meant Green Berets, and Green Berets meant elite soldiers, highly trained operatives, the kind of people who underwent rigorous selection processes and specialized training to do things that were definitely not ordinary, boring, or forgettable. Her father wasn't just any veteran. He was someone who'd qualified for one of the most selective and challenging units in the entire United States military. The next document had been even more revealing: a formal commendation letter referring to exceptional performance during classified operations in Central America, with most of the specific operational details blacked out by heavy black marker lines that clearly indicated government censorship rather than accidental redaction. The letter was signed by a full colonel, whose name Emma vaguely recognized from military history books she'd read about covert operations during the 1990s. But it was the third document that had made Emma's hands begin to shake uncontrollably as she'd read it. A Silver Star citation, the United States military's third highest decoration for valor, awarded to Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against hostile forces during an operation whose specific location, date, and tactical details were classified at a level that required special governmental clearance even to acknowledge. The citation's formal language described actions that sounded like something from a Hollywood action movie: leading a small team behind enemy lines, maintaining operational security under extreme pressure and hostile fire, successfully completing mission objectives while engaging numerically superior enemy forces, and ensuring the safety of civilian populations during the high-risk extraction phase of a mission whose very existence was apparently considered a state secret. Emma had sat in her father's desk chair, holding that Silver Star citation with hands that simply wouldn't stop trembling, trying desperately to reconcile the heroic figure described in the official military documentation with the quiet, self-effacing man who spent his days fixing university air conditioning systems and his evenings building wooden birdhouses in his garage workshop. The photographs contained in the second folder had only served to deepen and complicate her growing realization about her father's hidden past. Black and white images showed David Rodriguez, 25 years younger, wearing military uniforms that she now recognized as Special Forces operational gear, standing alongside other serious-faced soldiers whose bearing and equipment suggested they were people who'd seen and done things that had changed them permanently. In one photograph, a younger David was receiving what appeared to be a medal or commendation from a general whose chest was covered with ribbons and decorations indicating high rank and extensive combat experience. In another image, he was part of a small, elite-looking team posing with sophisticated equipment that she couldn't identify but that clearly looked specialized, expensive, and designed for purposes far beyond routine military operations. A third photograph showed her father in full camouflage face paint, holding what appeared to be an advanced rifle system, and looking directly at the camera with an intensity and focused alertness that she'd never once seen in the mild-mannered, quietly gentle man who'd raised her throughout her childhood and teenage years. But it was the contents of the third and final folder that had completely and irreversibly shattered every assumption Emma had ever made about her father's military service and the reasons for his lifelong silence about that period of his life. Documents bearing top-secret and classified stamps in red ink, mission reports with entire paragraphs blacked out by government censors, and photographs that appeared to have been taken in locations where American military personnel weren't supposed to be operating according to any publicly acknowledged policy. When Emma heard her father's Honda Civic pulling into their driveway that afternoon, she'd quickly but carefully returned all the documents to their proper folders, relocked the filing cabinet, and returned the key to its hiding place in the workshop, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she'd just discovered secrets that her father had successfully kept for more than 2 decades. That evening, when David had walked through their front door, wearing his ordinary university maintenance uniform and carrying his dented lunch cooler, Emma had found herself staring at him with completely new eyes. The quiet man who'd never discussed his military past wasn't unremarkable or embarrassing. He was someone whose truly remarkable past was simply too sensitive, too classified, and too important to discuss casually with family members or friends. Over the following weeks, Emma had begun conducting her own research into Special Forces operations during the 1990s and early 2000s, not seeking to uncover her father's specific classified activities, but rather trying to understand the broader context of the kind of work he'd clearly been involved in during his 20-year military career. What she'd learned had only deepened her newfound respect for her father's deliberate choice to remain silent about his service record. Special Forces soldiers of that era had been involved in operations that were still classified decades later, working in countries where American involvement wasn't officially acknowledged by any government, protecting civilian populations in situations where failure could have meant massacre, and disrupting terrorist and insurgent operations that could have resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. 3 months after her discovery of the classified files, Emma had made a life-changing decision. She'd applied for and been accepted to a prestigious journalism fellowship, focusing specifically on military affairs and national security reporting. The position required security clearance and would involve writing extensively about military families, veterans issues, and the unique challenges faced by people whose service to their country couldn't be publicly recognized or celebrated. The night before beginning her new fellowship position, Emma had found her father in his usual evening spot on their back porch, working methodically on yet another wooden birdhouse that he would complete, paint, and give away to neighbors without expecting thanks or recognition. "Dad," she'd said, settling into the chair beside him, "I want you to know that I understand now why you don't talk about your time in the army." David had looked up from the piece of wood he'd been carefully sanding, his expression remaining carefully neutral and unreadable. "What exactly do you mean by that, sweetheart? I mean, I understand that some kinds of service to your country can't be shared with family members, even with people who love you and want to know about your life. And I understand that sometimes the most important kinds of service are exactly the kinds that nobody else gets to hear about or celebrate." Her father had studied her face for a long, thoughtful moment. And for the first time in her life, Emma had seen something in his brown eyes that she'd never noticed before. Not embarrassment or shame about his past, but the careful, professional assessment of someone who'd spent decades learning to evaluate exactly what information was safe to share with whom and under what circumstances. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Emma had continued, "for everything you did that I can't know about, and for everything you do every day that I can see and appreciate." David had set down his sandpaper and looked at his daughter, with the same gentle, loving smile she'd known her entire life, but now she could see the deeper currents beneath that familiar expression. Years of classified operations, decorated military service, and the conscious choice to find meaning and purpose in simple, everyday things, after a career spent dealing with complex and dangerous situations that most people couldn't imagine. That evening, Emma had watched her father put the finishing touches on a small wooden house painted bright blue, and when he'd noticed her attention, he'd held it up with quiet satisfaction. "Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned that the bluebirds in her yard need a better place to nest this spring," he'd explained with characteristic modesty. "Figured this was something I could help with." Emma had looked at her father, this quiet, seemingly ordinary man who'd received a Silver Star for gallantry in classified military operations, who'd saved lives in dangerous situations she would never know about, and who now found deep purpose and satisfaction in helping elderly neighbors provide better nesting opportunities for backyard birds, and felt a pride in him that went far deeper than any military commendation or public recognition could possibly inspire. Her father wasn't boring, ordinary, or unremarkable. He was someone who'd done extraordinary things in service of his country, and then deliberately chosen to find meaning in the extraordinary work of being a consistently good parent, a reliable employee, and a thoughtful neighbor who built birdhouses for people without expecting anything in return.